So hi everybody, how you doing? My name is MJ Short. This is the name that I use for all the game development stuff. You can actually just call me Michael. I am not a software engineer, but I work in software development for enterprise companies during the day. Been doing that my whole entire life. I love it. I don't want to stop anytime soon. In the last couple of years, I have started doing game development in my spare time. And so what I want to talk to you guys about is a couple of things that I found out while doing that. Talk about the awesome failures that I've had that have gone down in big burning crashes, and then also talk about some of the successes that I've had that have led me to today. I would like to point out one thing. On a regular daily basis, I talk to enterprise companies from all over the world. I convince them to use our products. I sell them on great things constantly. I have never spoke actually about my game dev stuff before, so I am slightly terrified and nervous to talk about this tonight, so please bear with me. When Todd asked me to do this about 3 weeks ago, knowing that I'd never done this, I went out and actually read a book about it, right? So I finished that book this morning, wrote this speech, and we're gonna have a really, really good talk tonight. Cool. So you might know me from some of my more popular games, King Candy Crush Saga, presented by Microsoft Publisher 98 and Chevrolet. If you don't know me by that, you might know me from Arnold getting kicked in the balls in Total Recall, another one of my big games that I have done. So as I said, I'm a hobbyist game dad. I'm also a husband. I'm also a father. I'm also a senior lead employee at a Fortune 500 company. Back in 2012, I decided that I wanted to make games because I had this great idea for a tablet game, right? If you remember back in 2012, that's when like the tablet was new and it was refreshing. We had all these great touch interactions. They didn't suck and people just didn't put their gamepad controls on the screen, right? People were really experimenting with it. And I was really, really buying into that. I thought it was awesome. So I decided, hey, I'm gonna make games. I know how to do this. So I went and made 2 games. This is the first one right here. So this is the first mind-blowing game that I made ever. This is the protagonist down here, Mr. Belmont. Everybody's familiar with him. These are his enemies, the demons from Doom up there. The game was amazing. It took me 4 months to make. But honestly, I'm not really feeling good about my graphics and the way that I do art. So I never did anything with the game. But then I turned around and made another game. Once again, completely mind-blowing here. Right? This would have changed the mobile market if I would have released it. Once again, my art, just not that great, right? And so I didn't do anything with it, I just kind of left it shelved. I then started realizing that, hey, my daughter, who was 6 years old at the time, really, really likes this stuff, right? She likes games, she likes sitting around when I make games, she likes playing the games that I make. I'll start making a game with my daughter. So I started working on a game called Stella's Adventure. My daughter at the time drew about 50 different sheets of animations, or art. She also came up with all the mechanics for it. Actually, this is a 6-year-old who just basically designed a Metroidvania, right? This game is one huge open world, and the protagonist, Stella, goes through the world collecting stars. Every time that she finishes the game, she gets a new mechanic. She gets her rocket boot, she gets her umbrella that allows her to go back into the world and collect more stars. After you've collected all of the presents, you can then basically speed run the game, right? And so there's leaderboards and all these other things inside of it. We worked on this game for about a year. We got a lot of praise for this. This got me a lot of popularity. There are a lot of articles written about this game. It was championed along with Sissy's Magical Ponycorn Adventure as a way of bringing kids into games, especially girls. But as you imagine, having a 2-person team, and one of those persons is more interested in reading Smurf comics, playing Just Dance, dressing up like a Disney princess, and the other one's 6 years old, it's really hard to finish your game, right? So that game never got done. And hopefully it's something that I want to go back to and finish at some point. During that time, I also worked on 2 other games that I started and just kind of burned out on, right? I didn't really know how to finish a game. Work was really, really stressful. I was trying to be a dad. I was trying to be a husband at the same time. Those things are stressful enough on their own, but then adding these kind of unrealistic goals for yourself that are just kind of meandering and aimless was really, really hard, right? And then in 2013, found out about Game Making Frenzy. Is anybody familiar with that, or has anybody participated in that? Game Making Frenzy is a jam that the Wagos Rancheros guys put on and part of Venus Patrol. They've done 3 of them. The first time was an Adventure Time jam that they did as part of Fantastic Arcade. The second year was they had a space theme to it, and they always do it around the Fantastic Arcade time. So if any of you guys go to Fantastic Arcade, they always do the jam right around then. Last year was the Barfcade, where they made games about barfing, which is right up my alley, which I'll get to in a little bit. But so I discovered that, and I was like, wow, I have 72 hours to make a game. This is basically it. Pass or fail. I'm gonna make a game in 72 hours, right, and do something. It's also during this jam that I met Dave Shumway. He is a local sound designer. He now works for a company called Magic Leap down in Florida. He's a really, really great sound guy, and he did the music for my jam. I ended up making a game in 72 hours called Vidya Futera. It was actually originally called Vita, but I had not slept in 60 hours, so I misspelled it when I answered it, when I actually entered the name. So that's what it's called from it. So the jam for this was 72 hours long, and I had this awesome idea for this co-op game. I love co-op games. I don't like playing games where people are against each other. I like playing games where we work together. My idea for this co-op game is that one player can't move. All they can do is move the gun around, right, and shoot things. The other person can't shoot, but they can carry the other person, right? So these two people have to work together to basically move through the level, and then at certain points, has to drop this player and go in and actually make something happen. While this is happening, waves of bad guys are coming, etc., and this person has to shoot all of them and kill them. I thought this was a really, really, really great idea, so I did it. I worked 60 hours out of 72 hours, and I basically destroyed myself doing it. I was an awful dad during this time. I was a really, really bad husband, and I just kind of fell apart doing it. And nobody in my household was prepared for this, right, at all. I mean, you say to your wife, you say to your kids, hey, Dad's gonna make a game this weekend, right? And what does that mean? Dad's been making games for a year and a half, but no one was ready for really how it affected everybody in the family. And not only that, it affected me for weeks afterwards. I had pushed myself way too hard, and then Monday morning I had to get up and work 60 hours a week on my enterprise job. I had to fly to Atlanta, I had to do all this different stuff, right? And I basically almost wrecked my professional job doing this also. It was a really, really, really bad experience, but you know what? I finished the game. And that was awesome. I mean, it was depressing a little bit and somewhat, like finally pushing that publishing button and knowing that I couldn't fix any more bugs or I couldn't do anything with it was the scariest thing I've ever done in my life. But I did it, right? And I realized, hey, that wasn't actually too hard to finish a game. What was hard about it is that I didn't plan for it and I just kind of let it take over my whole entire life. So this is the first big thing I want to talk about. If you're a hobbyist game dev, you need to be participating in game jams. Flat out. How many people in here do game jams? Awesome, awesome. Not enough, right? Everybody I just came in and I talked to a couple people. Everybody I talked to who's a hobbyist dev like me, they always say the same things. Yeah, I'm working on a game. How long have you been working on it? 1.5 years. You ever finish a game? No, but I'm just working on a game, right? How do we know to actually finish this stuff and how to get it out if we've never done it before, right? So everybody needs to do game jams. There's game jams going on constantly. There's Let 'em Dare. There's just go to itch.io and just look for stuff. GameJolt has really, really great game jams going on all the time. They have different goals to them also. Some of them are 72 hours, some of them are 2 weeks, some of them are a month. Everybody needs to be doing it, right? Because you need to move from I'm making a game to I made a game. And that right there is really, really powerful and boosts a lot of confidence in you for making games after that, right? To be able to say, I actually made something, I completed it, I understand why I failed, I understand why I was successful, that's really, really powerful. The second reason you need to be doing that, or that's practicing finishing something. The second reason you need to do it is it improves your workflow, and you can't speak enough for this, right? Until you finish a game, you don't actually really understand how to finish a game. And so by finishing it, you can improve your workflow, understand what works for you and what doesn't, and that makes games in the future go bigger, right? At the same time, you can experiment with small ideas that will teach you to tackle bigger tasks in the games you're working on. Maybe you don't understand or have a really, really hard time with 3D arrays. Make a game jam about it, right? And you just experiment with 3D arrays. You can take that information back into your bigger projects and be successful with it. Those small games basically become a reference library for how did I tackle that before? How did I solve that and how did I do that? I think Jesse actually talked about, right? When he was doing 1 game a month, he was building a game and then he was adding on to it and taking those concepts and using them again, right? Having all these game jams behind us, it definitely works on that. right? So when I started doing game jams, I didn't participate in 1 game a month, but I basically did 12 games in 12 months also, right? And all of those, each game that I was building on, I was just not necessarily reusing it, but I was using the concepts that I used before to be successful in my next game jam. And this way, this may sound silly to sound, but by doing game jams, you'll actually become more effective at doing game jams, which then translates to understanding your process better. One of the things about actually finishing things is understanding what you need to actually complete a task. And by completing very small nuggets of that task, you can kind of keep building up to larger tasks. It also complements your schedule. As we talked about, most people in here have a day job, right? And so, you have a game that you've been working on for 1.5 years, but maybe you also have 8 hours on the weekend that you can sit down and knock something out. Nobody's gonna judge it and say, wow, this person worked on this for 2 years and look at this thing they produced. Everybody's gonna look at it and say, yeah, this person made it in a day. This is cool, I'm gonna check this out, right? And so complementing your schedule is a really, really big thing. We're gonna get more into that later when we talk about actually taking these ideas from a game jam and moving to a bigger release. The last thing is it allows you to experiment. And I'm gonna go more in depth about this. But one of the big things about this is it enables you to flesh out good ideas and flesh out bad ideas, right? A lot of times when you're just starting to build a game, there's a lot of things about it that you're learning at the same time, and you're not necessarily focusing on the design aspect of it. Or you're not necessarily focusing on what is the best game logic to use to get what you want, right? A lot of people, when they start building their first game, they make really simple mistakes. Instead of calling functions, they start checking for Booleans constantly, right? Which adds a lot of overhead to their games and things like that. You suss out a lot of these really, really bad concepts when you were building game jams like this and doing things like that. The other thing is that you get more immediate feedback for your ideas, right? How many people in here have been working on a game and never shown anybody that game? Have you shown your game to somebody?
Yeah.
Yeah? Did you get good feedback on it?
Yeah, actually, it wasn't too bad.
Yeah? How long did it take you to show that game?
Sometimes.
Sometimes. I'm sorry, I don't mean to pick on you, right?
Yeah,
but
no.
yeah, like my game, I didn't show anybody for a long time, right? Until it looked like Castlevania Cross with Doom, and then I was like, this is pretty sweet, right, hun? She's just like, yeah, cool, that's awesome. So you get more immediate feedback, right? People are playing your game, and people are giving you criticism, which is good or which is bad, right? Whatever works for you. Oh, thank you very much. I'm very passionate about game dev. The last thing is that you also get to experiment with ideas that wouldn't work in bigger releases. And I really want to dive into this by talking about humor in games and game experimentation. When I did my first game there, right, I thought that my concept was actually pretty cool on Video Fudora. I thought that it was really, really neat. And I released it, and about 75 people played it, and most people didn't play it for more than 2 minutes, right? And most people played it by themselves. I think the only people who actually played it is Animal Phase and Jocelyn Reyes. I don't know if any of you know Charles. They played it all the way to the end and thought it was really, really awesome, but nobody else did, right? So not only did I kill myself for 60 hours, nobody checked it out. And this is going to be a reoccurring theme that you find with game jams, right? But with game experimentation in game jams, what that allows us to do is it really allows us to check out things that would not work in bigger releases. A lot of people use that to experiment with mechanics. Daniel Lisson, who's a really, really great developer, goes by Managor. A lot of his game jams focus on just this very, very interesting mechanic that he does, and he does it for about 10 minutes and it's done, right? And you play it, you're like, wow, that's really awesome. I don't know if I could necessarily play a full game in this, but that was a really, really, really great 10-minute experience. Nina Freeman's How Do We Do It is kind of the same thing. It's this theme and this idea that's done really, really quick and really, really small, and you can check it out and you say, that was very interesting, and then you walk away from it, right? Unlike my first game, Video Fudora, where you kind of play it, it's confusing, you don't really understand what's going on, and you're like, okay, I'm gonna go play the next one. The way that I really like to experiment, though, is I don't really like to experiment with mechanics, and I don't necessarily like to experiment with story. I like to experiment with humor. To me, humor is one of the ways that I deal with all of my flaws in life, and it's a way that I cover up the bad things that happen to me and a way that I deal with the bad things that happen to me in my life. And it's also a really, really interesting way that I can give someone a 5-minute experience or I can give somebody a 2-minute experience. Humor in games is something that in the past, you think about old games from the 80s like Maniac Mansion or an adventure game where the adventure game didn't necessarily need to have that humor attached to it to be successful. It made it funny, right? But it could still function without it. And we've come a really, really long ways from back then. And people are using humor in very, very interesting ways lately. I'm going to talk about a little bit of them and a little bit of the ways that humor is used. So there's lots of different type of humor. There's black comedy, there's satire. I don't really want to talk about those because when it comes to games, humor is normally implemented in 2 different ways. One is there's humor that the player witnesses. A really great example of that is Portal. Everybody's played Portal. Portal is an incredible game, but the humor in the game, GLaDOS, is something that the player actually witnesses. The player really doesn't interact with any of the humor that's there. If you turn the sound off and never listen to it, you would still have an incredible, incredible puzzle game that you would play, right? So it's something that you just witness as you go through. Now there's a little bit of exceptions, right? The box with the heart on it, right, is a way that they kind of introduce that humor into the game, but that box has to be there no matter what. Even if the humor wasn't there, you would still be picking up that box and you'd still be interacting with it. That humor is 100% based on just you listening to it and seeing it and laughing along with it. I did the same thing and experimented with this with King Candy Crush Saga presented by Microsoft Publisher 98 and Chevrolet. This game is a super, super generic, poorly implemented match 3. Right? Which everybody makes. They're super simple to knock out. And it's actually a really awful implementation of it. But everything about the game is absurd, right? And I went further and further with the absurdity. There's a tripod website out there that I created for the game. You want to find that link? The link is King Candy Crush Saga presented by Microsoft Publisher 98 and Chevrolet.com, right? Starting with that, I get the player in. At the beginning of the game, you actually watch an ad for Chevrolet. Right? And then after that, you watch ads for GPC, cigarettes. I don't know if you guys remember those from the 80s. Then after that, you're watching ads for Laser. Everything in the game is branding, right? There's Clippy from Microsoft Publisher. There's Plan B, which is also one of the sponsors of this game, right? There's Chevrolet, there's Laser Malt Liquor. Everything in the game is ridiculous. When you match 3, you hear people going like, ooh, that's awesome. Yeah, you start getting cash. You get all this real visual stimuli that developers and companies use to basically trick you and abuse you. At the bottom, you get all your money piled up, right? And then you can open a store that's brought to you by Plan B, and you can buy more things. You can buy Microsoft Publisher 98. And you know what that does? That increases your happiness, right? It makes you happier so that you last longer in the game, okay? The visual style of this game sucks, right? Flat out, but it's supposed to look that way, right? It's supposed to look that way. All of this is part of the joke. But once again, I could have just made a really, really crappy match 3 and you have that game. Nothing about what you're doing is actually interacting with the humor or playing along with the humor, right? All of it is just you witnessing the humor. So when I implemented this, this was for the Candy Jam. This was back when King Games was doing what King Games does. And you know, this took me about 15 hours to do, and I got wrote about it from everywhere. Indie Static called it the best game of the jam, right? There were all these different things. And once again, just experimenting with humor and playing around with it, right, and doing that. Instead of worrying about mechanics, worrying about the presentation and what someone's going to walk away and tell other people about it. The other type of humor is there's humor that the player participates in, right? This isn't something that has been around for a very long time, but it's something that you're starting to see more and more about. A really good example of this is Stanley Parable. Everybody's played Stanley Parable? You've heard of Stanley Parable? Stanley Parable is not a game that you can necessarily explain to somebody. But if Stanley Parable did not have its humor, there wouldn't be a Stanley Parable. There would be no game. The actual mechanic of the game is the player interacting with the humor and playing along. If at any time the player decides, I'm not going to walk forward anymore, the humor doesn't work and the game doesn't work, right? So by its essence, the Stanley Parable needs you to interact with it for it to be successful. Right? And it needs you to interact with it and experience it for its humor to work. I also did this on a game called Hope. And so I want to say this, well, let me say one more thing. Stanley Parable has a lot of jokes in it, right? And when you're experimenting with humor, sometimes you come up with one really, really good punchline. just like a comedian would on a stage, right? But then you need to build a game around that. So I made a game, Hope, and I would like to actually show it to you guys. But I need to let you know that it deals with suicide and it deals with some other really bad things. If anybody has a problem with that, let me know, and I won't show the game. Okay.
And it might be a little funky because it's over airplane, so excuse any lagginess. I'm gonna get something real quick.
No rush.
This is a Game Jolt's ad, not mine. Okay. So this was made for the low res jam. The goal of this jam was to make a game in 32 pixels, right? I came up with this idea for an ending to this game that I really, really wanted people to experience or that I wanted to do. Once again, this is talking about experiencing humor in a way that a player has to actually interact with it. So the game is incredibly boring and mundane, right? When Warp Door actually featured this game, they just made a gift of the whole entire game and just posted it and said, you know, this is it, deal with it. But this is a way, right, that even though that is a really, really dark joke, right, and really, really black comedy to it, is presenting a joke, and you know what, you're going to walk away after you play this and you're going to tell somebody else about this game, and you're going to tell them, wow, the ending of that game, just wait till the ending of that game, right? And that kind of goes to something we're going to get to in a minute. Let me bring this back up. So just in case that didn't work, I actually had the whole GIF of it from Warp Door on there. Now there's another type of humor, and there's another way that you can actually pervert humor in game jams and experiment with it. So we talked about two different ways, right? There's the humor that the player witnesses, and then there's humor that the player participates in. Sometimes the player doesn't know that they're actually participating in humor. And so sometimes you can experiment with this humor by being that it's maybe only funny to me, right? Maybe everybody else out there is playing something else and they're thinking one thing, but secretly, I'm getting to laugh about this, right? So in the last Let 'em Dare, or two Let 'em Dares ago, the one about distant worlds, I started working on this really, really awesome game. Once again, these grand ideas, right? This awesome game with a girl who actually switches worlds between them, has to do things in one world, and then switches over to the other one. I decided that I probably wasn't going to finish that. It was going to destroy my life, so I came up with a different idea. I actually ended up writing an erotic twine game for this game jam, and I'm going to read some of it to you. I embrace you wholly, taking more of you into me until you are engulfed in my heat. A sudden stillness as I close around you. You weren't ready for my flames. They lick at your cold, doughy flesh. You relax, loosen, shrug off the day's icy slumber. You stir inside me, harden. Your wetness drips upon my glistening frame. A soft rustling emits from your body as you move. Now, I'll spare you guys the rest of it, right? But it's really good. This game got featured by a bunch of different sites. A bunch of people reviewed this game, and they talked about how passionate it was, how sensual it was. They talked about how great it was for a male writer to write something from this perspective that maybe wasn't necessarily a male, right? Over 10,000 people have played this game. People have emailed me about this game. Very, very not things that I would share in public, but people have written me things like, I really love this game, it meant a lot to me, like it was very sensuous. I'm gonna read this passage to you again, but I'm actually going to let you in on what this game is actually about. I embrace you wholly, taking more of you into me until you are engulfed in my heat. A sudden stillness as I close around you. You weren't ready for my flames. They lick at your cold, doughy flesh. You relax, loosen, shrug off the day's icy slumber. You stir inside me, harden, your wetness drips upon my glistening frame. A soft rustling emits from your body is removed. So this is a way that the joke is actually probably on the player, right? And the joke is on everybody who reviewed this game, but no one knows that, right? And so it's a way that we can experiment with humor. And so that everybody walked away from this thinking, oh, either that was kind of weird, I feel uncomfortable reading that, or, okay, I enjoyed that or whatever. But really, I was just laughing the whole time that everyone who wrote my erotic fiction about an oven and a frozen pizza. So I want to kind of move it from that, right, into the experimentation with humor. And I want to kind of talk about, realizing that has made me realize, and completing, 12 game jams in 12 months has really made me realize a lot of different things about game jams that I want to kind of share with you as hobbyist devs when you go out back and start experimenting with game jams. The first is a small scope. Understand that people are going to play your game for a short period of time. Give them something memorable to walk away with. Right? In my first game, we didn't see that. We saw that I had this very, very complex mechanics. It didn't necessarily make sense the first time you played it. But in my later games, you saw that all of those just have something very small that a person can walk away with it. Think about what is it they're going to tell their friends about your game. So like with a dark take on breaking free of the despair of mundane life, that's a good scope, right? I just explained the whole game, the whole experience in one sentence. Advertisements gone wild, right? Once again, very, very simple idea that I'm building a game around. Interactive fiction that explores the sexual tension between an oven and a frozen pizza. Once again, very, very small scope, right? The second is spend the first hour of your game jam setting a schedule. This is something that we're going to tie back into towards the end of this talk about releasing a full game to it, but I cannot overstate this, right? Understanding what you actually have to develop. If you have 72 hours to make a game, don't make a 72-hour game. Make a 10-hour game and plan accordingly for it, right? Put something together like, I'm gonna do 6 hours for art, I'm gonna do 2 hours for music, and I'm gonna do 8 hours for programming. Stick to it, stop if you reach that point, right? A lot of people in here I know do software engineering. These are the same kind of practices that you use to do that and scoping out those prospects as you do to scope out your game jam. The second thing is choose an aesthetic that works for your timeline. I cannot tell you how many devs I know who have done a game jam and spent the whole time making art for their game, right? Or I can't tell you all the devs that are lucky enough to find an incredible artist who that artist then spends the whole time making just a small piece of art that looks really, really awesome and they don't get anything functional. Choosing an aesthetic that works for your timeline is super, super important. You want to pick something that's visually pleasing, but that can produce incredibly quickly. For me, it's 4x4 blocks. I use 4x4 blocks for everything in my game. I go into Photoshop, I set my pen for 4x4, and I do all of my animations with that. Now, I may scale it up or down, depending on the resolution of the game, but it allows me to knock out animations like this in about an hour. If I'm going slow and getting distracted by Twitter and drinking at the same time. But everything in my game is 4x4 blocks, right? And at some point, this has now actually become my style. So when people see something like this, they know that this is something that I did, this is my art. But all of these things right here are from Game Jam games that I knocked out incredibly quickly. So I'm gonna kind of move from those ideas into how I ignored all of them and once again ruined my life by a game jam. So after a year of putting out games a month that took me 4, 8 hours, 10 hours to do, Space Cowboy Jam came out last year, run by Venus Patrol, and once again, Juegos Rancheros. It was a 2-week game jam that they put together. At the end of it, they would pick 10 games to take to the Marfa Film Festival. I made a game called Liberation, My Love. And this is a game that basically destroyed my life when I did it. The first thing is look at the scope for this game. A game where you explore an entire world with hardcore platforming sections to find 4 hidden bosses that you then have to defeat by using a shooting bully mechanic that is never really actually explained. Bosses have complex AI patterns that have multiple ways to defeat them. Also, did I mention the platforming is so hardcore, a majority of people never found a second boss, right? So I spent 2 weeks making that scope. Right there, we know that I've broken my cardinal rule about doing this, right? There's no way I can be successful because I've already designed myself out of a game, right? I already have so many things going on there. And the worst part is, I didn't tell myself this at first. Instead, I said, I'm gonna make a love letter to Silhouette Mirage, the best game that Treasure ever made, and one of my favorite games of all time, right? But somehow it actually turned into this because I didn't define my scope properly at the beginning of it, right? I didn't have that great idea that everybody's gonna walk away from and say, yeah, you should go check this game out. Here's exactly why it worked. The schedule, the jam was 2 weeks long. I didn't get everything finished. And I had game-breaking defects at launch. The last day of the jam, I had to build a tutorial for my game because I made it so confusing that nobody actually knew how to play it when they started it, right? So once again, I didn't set a schedule for myself. I was just like, hey, I got 2 weeks, that's tons of time. I'm just gonna start working my ass off. At the same time, I ignored my family, ignored my wife, ignored my daughter, right? I started having problems at work because I just committed myself to something that I couldn't actually do, and then I felt that I had to finish it, right? That's an awful feeling to have. And aesthetic. Instead of using the 4x4 blocks that I've become known for and that I can knock out, I decided to use a brand new art style that I've never used before. That animation is 900 pixels big. I was drawing at 900 pixels. That's completely ridiculous, right? And I was making these complex animations. May not seem complex to actual artists in the room, but they're a lot more complex than the 4 frames I was used to, right, for this game. And I was making 4 of these bosses with incredibly complex AI patterns that you could break and do other things. And I was doing all of this in 2 weeks, right? I have ignored every single thing that I understood that worked, right? It was a complete failure. The game was a complete failure. And it sucks because I'm really proud of it, right? I worked really, really hard on this. I think that if you take the time to understand this game, you'll do it. Of the 5,000 people who played this, only 1 person actually got past the first boss. Everybody else played it for about 4 minutes and then stopped playing it, right? I wasted so much time. I spent 4 days creating the final boss fight in here. Nobody ever saw it, right? I just wasted my time. That's what happens when you kind of ignore these grounding philosophies for that. But right after this finished, I was depressed as hell, right? I had just spent 2 weeks of my life, completely destroyed it. I wasn't sleeping, I was jacking myself up on caffeine. I was doing other things to get it done, and I needed a palate cleanser, right? I needed a light at the end of the tunnel to keep me going. And that's when I heard of something called a pizza jam. And a pizza jam was gonna happen in July. And it was gonna be 30 days, and it was gonna be really awesome. And so I kind of kept going through this. I trudged along and finished this with the eyes that, hey, I've got this great idea for a pizza game. I'm gonna do this right after I finish this one. So for my pizza game, I immediately started working on it, and I started following my rules. My scope was I was going to satirize life simulators in the Austin food scene. That is an incredibly simple, small scope, right? Is just doing this, and that was going to be it. And that's something that I've stuck to the whole life of the jam. My schedule, well, it's a 4-week-long jam. I planned 32 hours for this game. 10 hours of it I was going to spend on art. 2 hours I was going to spend on sound effects. That was mainly making oatmeal, mixing it with pineapple, and throwing it out of a box in my kitchen and recording it. 30 minutes of begging Dave Shumway to make music for a game about vomiting. And then 19.5 hours of programming, only because I had to spend 30 minutes with Dave. So I had a really good schedule for this also. Aesthetic, I'm gonna stick to what I know, right? Instead of doing these really complex stuff, I'm gonna go back to something simple with a very simple scope and a very simple idea. So I did this game. I finished it in the time that I allotted. I was really happy with it, but the game jam went defunct. So it got canceled about 7 days into it when I was about halfway through, so there wasn't anything going on. So one night, I'm playing this game with this mouse, this incredible pizza game that I've discovered, and I realized, you know what? I should put this on a tablet. I bet this plays better with your fingers. So I did an Android build of it and started playing it in bed one night, and I had an epiphany, right? Instead of releasing this as a game jam, this game was kind of a culmination of everything that I'd done for the last year. right? It espoused all the ideals that I'd used to build all my other games. It had humor to it. It was dark. I think it was kind of funny. It had really, really good music to it, and I thought it was a good experience. It's something that I wanted to take further. So I set off making Hyper Emesis Pizza and taking a game jam all the way to a full release. So I want to quickly go through some best practices if you ever decide to do the same thing. We have about like 13 minutes, so I'm going to get through this. The first thing is build your game responsive. I actually had a bigger speech about this, but then I realized he was doing the same thing. I completely screwed up my game by making it for PCs at 640 by 480. And then when I realized I wanted to run it on the Nexus 7 Android tablet, I had designed everything wrong for that, and it basically only works on iPad. So always think about not only making your game responsive, but where you want it to end up. And even if you don't want it to end up somewhere, make your game responsive. Make sure your user experience works. So I had built this as a jam. I hadn't really thought about the user experience at all. And then suddenly I got invited to go to Game On Austin and realized, hey, I don't like my user experience. So I brought an awesome user UX guy in who we spent a week doing it and completely rebuilt the whole user experience before Game On. This is the original user experience. You select a patron, in this case, the streaker. You then have to tap one of these and keep tapping back and forth as you do each task for it, right? It was very labor intensive. One of the things that he helped me realize is that there's a lot easier way to do it. You can tap a patron, and then you can just see their pizza, and then you can have them do it, right? So we made all those changes in about a week of the game. And the last is correct any shortcuts made during the jam. A lot of times you'll take code shortcuts, you won't notate your code, you won't follow best practices. Go back and fix that before you start to take that game to an actual release. You will thank me in the end of it. So the last thing that I want to talk about, now that I have about 10 minutes left, are we good on that?
Totally, yeah, go for it.
Is balancing being a hobbyist game dev while also being a parent, spouse, senior lead employee, or a full release is just a macro game jam. So being a hobbyist game dev is stressful, right? It's not necessarily stressful for you. It's stressful for your kids. It's stressful for your job, and it's stressful for your partner, right? Because you are 100% concentrated on something that doesn't necessarily have an end. It doesn't necessarily have a goal. It's just a hobby that you're doing, right? But you're spending all your time doing it. But if you're a hobbyist game dev, you are also very fortunate, right? If you make a game, say, about barfing on pizzas, and nobody buys this game, you can still eat tomorrow, and your daughter can still have clothes. That's a very, very fortunate situation to be in, because it means that you can experiment a little bit more and you can take risks. Hyper Emesis Pizza finally came out last week, and if nobody would have bought that game, I would have been completely happy. I made a game about puking that criticizes Apple, and Apple put it on their store. That's a really, really great thing that I'm happy about, right? So I don't care if anybody actually buys it. But I'm very fortunate to be in that position. A lot of game devs out there have to survive and have to make different choices based on it, right? So while we understand that this is very stressful, we also need to understand that we're very fortunate as hobbyist game devs. So the first thing is scope, right? So now I have a game that originally had a 32-day scope, but I want to take it up to a bigger release, right? But I'm still going to keep the same small scope to it. I'm not going to say just because I have more time, I'm going to increase the scope because it's going to change the game. But, you know, I may add 50 patrons into it when before I only had 2. And maybe there's now 4 proprietors of the restaurant. And now there's achievements. And now there's a day light cycle. So I guess I increase the scope a little bit, right? But in the main goal, if I talk to someone and tell them about what the game's about, it's still about the exact same thing. I never changed that goal about it. Something else that's really important about scope is defining success. As you guys heard, what success was for me was putting a game on Apple's App Store that not only criticized them, but that was out there for everybody to play, right? That's what I would have considered a success, okay? And I defined that very early on, so I knew what I was working for. I didn't have to worry about things like, oh my gosh, 10,000 people have to play this, I'm gonna take the vomiting out of it, because most people don't like that, right? Which I found out is not true. At Game On, everybody thought the vomiting was the greatest thing they'd ever saw before. I don't know why. So define your success. Do it early and understand it and stick to it and don't let that change. I wanted to take Hyper Emesis Pizza from a jam game to full release on the iOS App Store in 6 months, right? So there's my success right there. And that's what I have my criteria to go by. The second is schedule. If you notice, these are the same things we talked about for a game jam. They're just over a longer period of time. And by doing game jams, you now understand that you can do all these things because you've been practicing and you've been doing this, right? So first, make an estimate of how long you want to spend on it. I want to spend 6 months on hyperemesis pizza. At least 4 days a week, work no more than 2 hours, but at least 1 hour on your game. This is really important. If you have partners, if you have kids, if you have another job, you need to balance and manage how much time you are spending on your hobby. If you don't, your hobby will take you over and will ruin everything else. Real simple, right? You need to put checks and balances on that and say, this is my hour. What else that allows you to do is it allows you to talk to your kids, it allows you to talk to your partner and define what you're going to do in your relationship. You're gonna say, hey, from 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock in the morning, that's my hour to work on game dev, and then I'm done for the day, right? That's really powerful. Really powerful, because then your hobby isn't becoming this pit of despair that you're throwing all your time into. You're playing other games, you're spending time with the people you like, right? Those are really good things that can keep you going as a hobbyist game dev and keep you connected to your hobby. 1 day a week, don't do anything game dev related. I prefer this to be a weekend day. A lot of people pick a day during the week where they have something special at night. Don't think about it. Don't talk about it. Don't do anything related to game dev, right? And the reason that is once again, this is your hobby. You cannot let it take over your entire life or it will ruin your sustenance and it will ruin everything else that allows you to do your hobby, right? And so we're gonna take 1 day a week in our schedule when we're planning out how long it's gonna take us to release this game. Well, we're not gonna do anything game dev related. Schedule 2 things a week with other people in your life, right? One of the other things about game dev where it traps you down is you're spending time with your computer more and more. You're spending time in your code. You're spending time playing your game, and you're forgetting everything else around you that gives you that sanity that allows you to continue making games, right? Always do this. Always schedule 2 things a week. Take your game and show somebody else, right? Meet at the bar, have them play your game. Get out and do something else. Take this into account when you're planning how long it's going to take you to finish your game. Create checkpoints, and these need to be meaningful checkpoints, right? So like with hyperemesis pizza, I said, I'm gonna have all the achievements done by August. And that was my goal, was to get the achievements done. I'm not saying that you need to sit down in Jira and plan out your whole entire project, but you need to have a meaningful checkpoint that when you reach the end of August, you can say, shit, I didn't get those achievements done. Am I actually gonna hit December? And push your schedule out if you need to. Do more game jams during development. This is really important. Working on one game for a very long time is hard. It can get depressing. It can feel like you're never going to finish this. It can feel like you've taken on a task that you can't finish. Finish other stuff while you're doing it, right? Not only does this keep you creative and keep your mind kind of free of things, but you can use some of that to take back into your game, right? This is really important, that in your hobby can't be about a goal that you can't finish, right? Your hobby can't be this one task that you have set up for yourself that you're never going to complete, right? Your hobby has to be game dev, not making a game, right? My hobby is not making hyperemesis pizza. My hobby is making games. Do it, right? Even if you're creating a big game, every big dev that I know, right, that's out there making games is working on small stuff every once in a while, right? Because it keeps you sane. Don't game dev at your day job. This may seem completely obvious. It's not, right? The minute that you start game deving at your day job, it's not your day job anymore. It's now invaded every part of your life. It actually works in reverse. It's the same way of don't take your work home with you, right? Because if you take your work home with you, you never stop working. You're always working. And the lines, the distinctions between this is my day job, this is my hobby, this is my life, are now blurred to the point where it doesn't matter anymore. And I know it's really tempting. It's really tempting to maybe write some pseudocode and notes about this feature you want to implement, right? It's really cool. It's really common or really easy. You already have Sublime open. I'm just going to go over to this other file and make some quick changes. Don't do it, right? That job is a job that pays you and keeps you fed. Don't do anything to jeopardize it, right? You may not realize it, but by taking time away and doing this other stuff, you're distracting yourself and you're not really giving the company your full. They will notice it and it will have repercussions in the future. Don't do it. Keep it separate, keep it determined, right, and keep a schedule around it. And the last thing is be honest with important people in your life about your hobby. This one is really hard, and a lot of people don't think about this, right? Telling someone, hey, I'm working on a game, or telling your partner, hey, I'm gonna go work on my game, it's kind of just this very not really expressive of what's actually going on with you, right? Instead, be super honest with them. Hey, I'm gonna make a game and I'm gonna release it in December. What it's gonna take out of me and out of our relationship is an hour a day and 1 day a week. I will not do any game dev and I will spend time with you. That is incredibly important, right? Don't make your loved ones or children or anybody else in your family suffer because of your hobby, right? Be super honest with them and follow this schedule for success. Aesthetic. Stick to your original aesthetic. Don't say, just because I have 6 months, I'm suddenly gonna hire this awesome artist that's gonna blow the schedule up. If you're doing it by yourself, stick to what you know, right? Especially if it's one of your first games that's not a game jam, stick to something small, stick to an aesthetic that you're comfortable and used to. Now, if you're lucky enough to have an incredible artist on your team, a lot of that goes out the window. They can handle a lot of that for you. You're just implementing their art. But if not, do the same. With Hyperemesis Pizza, I did the same art style, I just increased it, right? I have dynamic lighting, I have dynamic day and night cycles, I created 50 paint trains, I did all this other stuff, but it still kept the really, really same simple aesthetic. So success. Hyperemesis Pizza got released on the iOS App Store January 21st. I did what I said in 6 months by following that schedule, right? There were a lot of times that I did not think this was actually going to happen. But I kept sticking with that schedule, and I finally reached success. So once again, scope, success, and schedule. If you're a hobbyist game dev, and you do game jams, and you're learning from that, or you want to do a big release, if you aren't doing these first 3 things at the beginning of your project, there's a good chance that you're not going to actually deliver what you want to do, or you're going to destroy something that you wanted while you're doing it. Is there any questions about that? No? Okay, cool. Thank you guys very much for your time. I appreciate it. Are there any questions in general? Yeah, go ahead.
I'll throw out 2 points.
Yeah.
Not necessarily questions. So one thing that's really helpful, I find, is I do task lists. So I constantly have like a task list if I'm doing like a game jam or something, just to keep track of everything. Because if you're going like really fast and you're trying to throw everything together, I forget it. Yeah. So I'll use like a OneNote or something where it's like at least it's a task list with a checkbox, and I keep track of like every idea, every bug, and everything. And I always taught people, like, as you're going through a game jam, if you just throw everything down on this list, like you'll never get to the list, but try to prioritize and just throw it down, because the game jam is a sketch of something you could do that's better afterwards. So if you don't finish the game jam, like, but you're right, like if you're, I'm in the same boat. I have 2 kids and a wife who already hates that I'm already like doing games all day long and talking to game devs and playing games, and games is everything, and the kids are addicted to games. So like I don't, the last few Dares I haven't even finished. I just started, threw an idea out, went to about 16 hours and was like, okay, well that's as much as I can do. I'll readdress that idea later. But the point being, like, try to collect all that information so that that's just fodder for as you go through and make more games.
Yeah, definitely.
And the other thing I was gonna say, and it's one thing that I've been playing around with after the 1 game a month, because that was like killing me. Is I've been playing around more with an idea of I like time boxing everything I do. So like I'll use like Pomodoro time where like I'll work for 20 minutes and then I'll take a 5-minute break and that kind of stuff. And I haven't put it down formally, but I've been playing with this idea of something I call like the 240-hour rule, where you give yourself an allocated block of time. This is how long I want to make this game for, and if it goes over that, then I have to ship it at that moment. And 240 hours is basically 8 hours a day. But for people who don't, if it's just your hobby, you could spend 240 hours for the next 3 or 4 months. But as long as you know that there's an end coming and you have to stop, because once you start pushing back, you never release. And the most important thing is actually release it. It doesn't have to be good, it just has to be out there.
Yep.
So those are my 2 things.
No, definitely. And that's a lot of things a lot of people face about that. You know, it's got to be out there when you ship it, right? A lot of people, especially when their first game, they're looking at what everybody else who's one person is doing, and they're expecting that their first game is going to be awesome and be like that too. It's not, right? It's going to be a lo-fi aesthetics game about puking all over pizzas, right? That's on a tablet that no one plays, right? That's what your first game is going to be, unless you're the 1 in 5 million chance, right? That creates like the most amazing thing when you first go out. Get something finished and ship it. Any questions? Yeah.
What are 4x4 blocks?
So 4x4 pixels.
Pixels?
Yeah. So when I go into Photoshop, I set my pen to 4x4, which means 4 pixels across, 4 pixels down, and I draw everything at that scale. It allows me to just whip out animations incredibly fast. And, well, so as I said, but at the same time, I try to make it aesthetically pleasing, right? So even though I'm using a really blocky format like that, I'm still trying to use very evocative colors. I'm still trying to apply some art sense to what I'm doing, but at the same time, I need to be able to do art super fast. I don't feel comfortable about my art skills, as you saw from the first 2 games I did. An interesting thing about those, they actually have artists now and are actually going to full release. One of those will be, I'll be at the South by Southwest Expo showing it off for the first time. But so this is what was important about Hyperemesis Pizza, is it stays to that aesthetic. It's kind of a combination of everything that I've done, and it's a chapter in my life that I get to close at the same time.
Your daughter's a good artist.
What?
Your daughter's a good
Yeah, my daughter's,
Really like
so
that.
here's the weird thing, my daughter is an incredible artist for somebody that's drawing stick figures and unicorns and things like that. It looks really awesome, and what we did with that game is she would actually draw the art. I would scan it by hand, I would take it into Photoshop, and I would animate it by cutting it up and then moving pieces around. It was a really time-consuming process to do it, but the end result is actually really cool. It looks like this kind of cardboard, or not cardboard, but just kind of like kids drawing papers come to life. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
There was, you mentioned there was one of the games you did where very few people made it to the second boss. What did you use to record those metrics? How did you know where people got to? How long they played for?
So I use Google Analytics, right? And I tie it to different events in the game to help me do that. I laugh because there was a time when I was doing game jams that I could not actually get Google Analytics implemented correctly. So I had this bright idea in the 10 hours I was making the game that I'm going to put a MySQL server up, and I'm going to write a PHP script, and I'm just going to call that PHP script every single time I want to record an event. And then I end up with DreamHost emailing me like, hey, you suddenly have all this garbage data just coming into your database, and we have to take your server down unless you pay more money. So I made sure on my next game that Google Analytics actually worked. Yeah, go ahead.
So, like for your sound, do you let someone else do that?
So in my game jams, I normally handle all of the sound effects myself. I use, oh my god, I just totally forgot, free sound. Holy shit, this is embarrassing. There's a really awesome website out there where people post open source sound effects. I think it's freesounddb.org, where you can go and find sound effects. I use a lot of that. I will normally pawn my music, I shouldn't say that. I will normally find somebody else to do my music. I also do music in my spare time. I love doing music, but in a game jam you have to know your limits, right? And anything you can get off to somebody else is really awesome. So I've been very fortunate in finding Dave Shumway to do my music for me. And I know that I can always kind of rely on him to jump in and knock something out really quick for me.
Is it free sound?
How about this? When I'm finished, I will look it up and do it to you. Any other questions or anything you want to see me talk about? Yeah.
So you mentioned that Hyperemesis Pizza is a criticism of Apple, but I didn't totally follow in what sense that is. Are you willing to reveal that?
Yeah, I'll definitely talk about that. Hyperemesis Pizza originally started an idea is satirizing life simulators. And I don't necessarily think that life simulators need to be satirized. I think Paper Please is probably one of the best games I've played in the last 10 years. But this is around the time that Paper Please was coming out, Cart Life was coming out. And a lot of people were making these games with very mundane tasks that you're doing over and over, right? And that's the part of life simulators that I was more satirizing. At the same time, the game is completely on its surface satirizing the Austin food scene and the food scene in general. The idea that you have all these people coming to the hip, trendy Hyperemesis Pizza, they're asking for a normal pizza, the scumbag working the place is going and getting household chemicals, consuming them, and vomiting on their pizza, and they're happy with it, is satirizing the Austin food scene. At the end of each level, when the day's over and you have to add up your expenses, you get to buy things with your expenses, like jorts, or a dumb haircut, or things like that, which increase your hipster bonus, and then customers like you more, they won't get angry as fast. But hidden underneath all of that is a very sharp criticism against Apple as the gatekeeper of the games on iOS. And so that satire about people coming into the store and just wanting a simple pizza, but being giving something toxic, is really a criticism of the way that the App Store works, right? Apple, as the gatekeeper of their App Store, it's their job to make sure that when customers come to them, that they're getting a good experience and not push abusive games that are anti-consumer to the customers, not feature them as editors' choices and other things. Google has been very good about that lately and kind of sussing a lot of that out, but Apple is still very much, I don't want to say taking advantage because they're not taking advantage, but it's their job as the gatekeeper to make sure these customers are getting a good experience. They're not doing a good job of it, and they're pushing abusive games to the user. That criticism is summed up in the idea of a person coming in, just wanting a pizza, and getting vomit all over them and going away thinking they're happy. Don't tell them I said that, it'll take my game off the store. I want to say one other thing real quick. You know, I am making a game about vomiting, and while that does have a novelty factor, right, I understand the scope of the game, right, and I understand who it's going to appeal to. One of the things that I did when we were releasing this is I believe that when you hire anybody, you need to pay them money, and you need to respect them like they're a member of your team, right? So in all of my projects that I do, I never ask an artist to work for free. I never ask an artist to give me props. Those are really, really shitty things, okay, to do. So everybody who works for me gets paid. As I mentioned earlier, I had a UX guy come in and spend a couple hours helping my UX. That guy got paid. I had a guy come in and do typography for me. That guy got paid, right? One of the ways that I paid my music guy is I actually printed up cassette copies of the soundtrack, right? So everything about Hyper Emesis Pizza is this very lo-fi aesthetic feel. Along with that, we also have tapes that nobody has tape decks anymore. To sell with it, right? So it's just another way of kind of keeping the whole idea of my game going, and this is very simple idea of lo-fi aesthetics, satirizing these certain things. Cool. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. So there's a lot of really cool and useful information on a presentation like this.
Mm-hmm.
Will there be somewhere online we might be able to review some of the?
Yeah, I can definitely release this and put that out there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I'd like to jump back to maybe some of the schedules and the ideas about scope.
Yeah.
Refine me.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was going to try to post a recording of it as well,
Okay,
like
cool.
a video recording. Maybe
Was this recorded?
I recorded the audio.
Okay.
Sorry.
You're sweating my ass off and choking out my own spit. Yeah.
I can sync it up to the slides.
Okay, cool.
hopefully, so, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, either he'll post it or I'll.
Yeah.
One of us will. Perfect.
Cool. Does anybody have any other questions? Guys, thank you very much for letting me speak again and being sharing.